Today we are now going to have three more papers. So I'll introduce each of the presenters. We'll have each of their talks, and then we'll have the questions at the end. So I had originally scheduled for this panel, and it was advertised as being 2 hours long. But since we have three presenters rather than four, we don't have to go until 3:15. So if we want to finish at 3, that's also fine. But if we have plenty of discussion, we can also go on to the original for the original time. Okay, so if everybody's ready, let's start the next session. So we're going to start with a paper by Nikolai Smirnov from Brown University. And his paper is entitled "The Significance of Internal Ideas and External Ideals for Character Development in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov." And all of these three papers will be dedicated to the Brothers Karamazov. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Kate. I'm just going to share my slides. Just give me a second. I need to open the correct tab. Okay. Here we go. You guys able to view? Okay, wonderful. Okay, are you, so tell me this, are you still able to view my slides if I shift right here? Are you still able to see them?
We still see them. We see them in the kind of not in the slideshow mode, but in each of the slides separately on the left-hand side.
Okay, so I press the slideshow.
Yeah, and that should be perfect. Do you want to just push forward to check that we can see the next slide?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm able to read the presentation, which is in a different window. So
okay, no problem. Yeah, that's good. That's all good.
Wonderful. Okay, so this paper is literary analysis in the classic style of it, of the brothers Karamazov, using, I'd say, very little secondary sources. And I specifically tried not to go out of the book, but rather stay within it and within the chapters within Dostoevsky's words and letters. So I'll begin. So the significance of internal ideas and external ideals for character development in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Just remember that my quotes will be in Russian because I do believe that the quotes that I chose, the Russian language is necessary to transfer what I want to say. So Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov is a comprehensive study of the inner workings of the human mind and soul, in which the author fuels his characters with a vital necessity to have some sort of longing, passion, or zeal to justify their existence in this world and provide them with a sense of purpose. Mikhail Bakhtin refers to this state as an idea that the character is wholly taken by, an idea which provides them with a moral backbone throughout their life. I quote Mikhail Bakhtin here. What is important is not the ordinary qualifications of a person's character or actions, but rather the index of a person's devotion to an idea in the deepest recesses of his personality. Not all of Dostoevsky's protagonists, however, are carriers of ideas. Some convince themselves of the righteousness of an external ideal. Katerina Ivanovna Verkhovtsev stands out as a secondary character who pursues an external ideal of virtuousness, and no experience of deep shame can move her to abandon or neglect her devotion to that ideal. The line between these two passions, the devotion to the idea that the person develops from within and the external ideal that one follows, is not always obvious. And yet it is useful, for the sake of analysis, to suggest that Dostoevsky's protagonists are divided into two groups. One group, represented primarily by Alyosha, conjures some profound sense of purpose from an internal source, often initiated by a deeply personal memory that triggers an epiphanic, otherworldly spiritual experience. The other group, which includes Katerina Ivanovna, Ivan Karamazov, and very possibly his father, Fyodor Pavlovich, rationalizes their trauma and imposes an intellectual vision of or explanation for their current reality. Most importantly, both experiences manifest themselves during an extremely challenging and mentally taxing life event with oftentimes unpredictable results. Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov is the patriarch of the clan. He is the biological father of Dmitry, Ivan, Alyosha, and allegedly Smerdyakov. However, Fyodor Pavlovich's behavior towards his sons could not be characterized as fatherly in any way. From the early opening chapters, Fyodor Pavlovich becomes entrenched in the reader's mind as a vindictive sensualist who takes great and obsessive pleasure in the creation of scandals and dramatic enactments of sadistic buffoonery. In the chapter The Old Buffoon, Fyodor Pavlovich openly admits to this obsessive drive and his absolute lack of control over it. And I quote here, «Я шут коренной, не спорю, что и дух нечистый, может, во мне заключается. Для того и ломаюсь, чтобы милее быть. А впрочем, и сам не знаю иногда для чего». Dostoevsky positions Fyodor Pavlovich to be altogether an abhorrent character, both in his physical being and his actions. I quote here again. «К острому подбородку его подвешивался еще большой кадык, мясистый и продолговатый, как кошелек, что придавало ему какой-то отвратительно сладострастный вид». The description of his Adam's apple conjures the image of an aging, reptilian character who stands as the literal embodiment of a life dedicated to the pursuit of sensual pleasures. The focus on his Adam's apple also hints at Fyodor Pavlovich's role as Adam, in the sense of being the first man, the family patriarch, formed of the dust of the ground. Even the etymology of his name, Karamazov, comes from the Turkish kara, which means black, and the Russian maz, or mazit, to smear, to smudge, suggesting an inherent dark yet fertile soil, smearing the world and all who come near to Fyodor Pavlovich's abode. He performs the crucial role of provoking others, fueling already established tensions and bringing people around him to their tipping point. In creating Fyodor Pavlovich, Dostoevsky invests even his most revolting character, a bedbug, with a defining principle, arguably a philosophical position. Fyodor Pavlovich's repulsiveness is a manifestation of a life devoted to the philosophy of wickedness and sensuality, which he articulates to Alyosha in the evening after their meeting with Father Zosima at the monastery. This is in Book 4, Chapter 2, and the first quote is on the slides for your observation. «В скверне-то слаще, все ее ругают, а все в ней живут, только все тайком, а я открыто. Вот за простодушие-то это мое, на меня все сквернавцы и накинулись. А в рай твой, Алексей Федорович, я не хочу. Это было бы тебе известно, да порядочному человеку оно даже в рай-то твой неприлично, если даже там и есть он. По-моему, заснул не проснулся, и нет ничего. Поминайте меня, коли хотите, а не хотите, так и черт вас дери. Это моя философия». Consequently, Fyodor Pavlovich's actions do serve a purpose. They are intended to be openly wicked, for him to find pleasure therein. He stands out as the antidote to society's ethical norms, but finds, nevertheless, monetary profit in this buffoonery. Fyodor Pavlovich is taken over by the idea of wickedness, pushing it beyond any traditional conceived boundaries of morality, which he proceeds to challenge with relish. Fyodor Pavlovich decides to justify his manner of life by reinforcing the aesthetic positions of the Enlightenment, but adding to this his penchant for blasphemy. He ultimately finds justification in ideas that stem from the outside world, rather than basing any justification on his own internal and unique discoveries. All this has long ago left him in a state of physical and mental destruction, while granting him a license to follow his dissipated and sadistic inclinations. However, he is certainly not the only character who suffers from a passionate devotion to the worldly ideals. Rather, Fyodor Pavlovich is just one specimen of a collection of the novel's personages who pursue an external ideal and, as a result, are scarred by a mental strain that is observed in the patterns of their behavior and speech. Now, the word strain, a very imprecise translation of the Russian nadriv, appears countless times in the Brothers Karamazov and is particularly frequent in the chapters Strain in the Drawing Room, Strain at the Cottage, and In the Fresh Air. The ultimately untranslatable nadriv indicates a state of highest anxiety, unhappiness, and dramatic protest that stops just prior to culminating as a total mental breakdown or breakthrough. Victor Terrace emphasizes that nadriv, rupture, becomes firmly established as a certain human type, represented by Katerina Ivanovna, Ivan Karamazov, and their assorted doubles. The integrity and happiness of these men and women is ruptured by the strain of their self-conscious pride. And I end the quote here. This strain results from an internal mental conflict caused by the tension between a person's infatuation with an external idea, such as self-conscious pride, and the repression of their more natural internal longing. Dostoevsky not only creates mentally complex and physically challenged protagonists, but also unforgettable portrayals of secondary characters, such as Katerina Ivanovna. Madame Khokhlakov prefaces Katerina and Ivan's interaction with Alyosha by emphasizing that Katerina Ivanovna is thirsting to see him. Она вас жаждет, thus implying his presence is simply a vital necessity. Alyosha's youth and innocence, coupled with his desire to follow the path of purity and become a monk, gives him a particular status of a judge in human affairs. Katerina searches for Alyosha to obtain from him this sense of validation that she too is acting virtuously and purely. In Madame Khokhlakov's perceptive judgment, this interaction between Ivan and Katerina Ivanovna is prefaced to Alyosha as, and I quote here, «Это ужас. Это самая фантастическая комедия. Она любит вашего брата Ивана Федоровича и уверяет себя изо всех сил, что любит вашего брата Дмитрия Федоровича. Это ужасно». Khokhlakov's use of comedic and terrible as far as her character is concerned is somewhat unusual, showcasing her words as a flash of common sense. Her perception illuminates Dostoevsky's intent to show how a person's decision to deny their internal longing and replace it with an externally sourced, self-conjured idealization causes their life to take on the qualities of a dark comedy. In a macabre manner, the reader is appalled to see Ivan and Katerina boldly walk towards their ruin and the ruin of others. It is also deliberately and in mockery that Ivan supports Katerina Ivanovna's strained decision to never leave Dmitry Fyodorovich. And this is the next quote for your observation on the slides. Что для других лишь обещание, то для нее вековечный, тяжелый, угрюмый, может быть, но неустанный долг. И она будет питаться чувством этого исполненного долга. Ваша жизнь, Катерина Ивановна, будет проходить теперь в страдальческом созерцании собственных чувств, собственного подвига и собственного горя. Но впоследствии страдание это смягчится, и жизнь ваша обратится уже в сладкое созерцание раз и навсегда исполненного, твердого и гордого замысла. Now, Victor Terrace's interpretation of this moment is on point, as he says, this moral lecture, bitterly ironic of course, may be seen as a parody of Father Zosima's words of consolation. Ivan does not realize that while making fun of Katerina Ivanovna very cruelly, he is actually projecting upon her some of his own attitudes. We can observe that in the sense of fulfilled duty and Katerina Ivanovna's incessant desire to be virtuous lie the pride and adoration of her supposed virtues by denying herself real happiness and remaining with a man who does not love her and whom she loves only in a state of strain, formed as a result of being devoted to an external ideal that she has convinced herself to be true. A possible interpretation of how similar Ivan's speech to Katerina is to Zosima's words of consolation reveals Ivan's propensity to tell a person what they want to hear while covertly underpinning his own values and beliefs throughout the speech. Consequently, while Ivan produces a correct analysis that Katerina's pride will nourish her existence when it is consumed by constant suffering, he is partially speaking about himself. Ivan Karamazov is just starting to go through his own state of mental collapse due to his pursuit of a secular intellectual ideal. He chases a self-generated ideal of ultimate rationalism, rejects all religious and spiritual explanation for his feelings, memories, and identity, focusing solely on the purely logical. Just as Katerina Ivanovna obsesses with the ideal of her shining virtue to nourish her own pride, Ivan clings to his rational deductions, taking pride in being perceived as desensitized to any type of emotion, reveling in his rebellion, and convincing himself of the validity of an external ideal. Ivan is unable to see that he is denying his own emotions of repressed love for Katerina Ivanovna. The parodying of Zosima's style of speech, as well as the monk's manner of reasoning, highlights Ivan's emotional slippages. For this scene with Katerina is one of the rare moments when the reader gets to see a glimpse of Ivan's true feelings. Usually sarcasm, mockery, and simmering anger dominate Ivan's speech, characterized by such remarks as «Один гад съест другую гадину», «Обоим туда и дорога», и «Все позволено». His exchange with Katerina Ivanovna then unveils the internal conflict between his true feelings for her and his desire to be seen as wholly desensitized to any kind of emotion. Now, in contrast to these two lovers, Alyosha is the only one capable of exposing Ivan's idealization of ultimate rationality and Katerina's obsession with her own pride. And this is the next quote for you to observe on the screen. Я, право, не знаю, как я все это теперь смею, но надо же кому-нибудь правду сказать, потому что никто здесь правды не хочет сказать. «Какой правды?» — вскричала Катерина Ивановна, и что-то истерическое зазвенело в ее голосе. «Потому что вы мучаете Ивана, потому только, что его любите, а мучите потому, что Дмитрия надрывом любите, в неправду любите, потому что уверили себя так». Alyosha's directness reveals Dostoevsky's intent to have his character start adopting some of the late elder's talents. Katerina Ivanovna is instantly angered by Alyosha's clairvoyant simplification. Вы маленький юродивый, вот вы кто. In a scene that follows immediately, the reader is finally able to see the real Ivan, the one behind the mask of ultimate rationality, the one that feels deeply and passionately. And this is the next quote for you to observe on the screen. «Ты ошибся, мой добрый Алеша», — проговорил он с выражением лица, которого никогда еще Алеша у него не видел, с выражением какой-то молодой искренности и сильного неудержимо откровенного чувства. Никогда Катерина Ивановна не любила меня. Она знала все время, что я ее люблю. After this shocking outburst of sincerity, Ivan storms out in turmoil from showing the Karamazovian, sensual, and thus inherently real part of his identity. This event identifies him as a character who, along with his brother Dmitri, derives his sense of self and purpose from an internal source that comes to him without demanding a total rejection of his real thoughts and feelings. In this way, the characters are introduced to their authentic selves that will come to direct their future lives. By the time the chapter Cana of Galilee unveils, Alyosha has gone through several challenging experiences that have shocked his confidence and sense of self and made unclear his purpose in this society. After all these challenges, Alyosha is not beaten down, but replies with a surprisingly emphatic faith in Grushenka. And this is the next slide for you to observe on the screen. «Не смейся, Ракитин, не усмехайся, не говори про покойника. Он выше всех, кто был на земле», — с плачем в голосе прокричал Алеша. «Я не как судья тебе встал говорить, а сам как последний из подсудимых. Кто я пред нею? Я шел сюда, чтобы погибнуть, и говорил «пусть, пусть». И это из-за моего малодушия, а она через 5 лет муки. Только что кто-то первый пришел и ей искреннее слово сказал, все простила, все забыла и плачет». Ракитин, несмотря на всю свою злость, глядел с удивлением. Никогда не ожидал он от тихого Алеши такой тирады. When we observe Alyosha's outburst here, we often miss how surprising his answer of faith is, considering what Grushenka just told him. «Видишь ли теперь, Алеша, какая я неистовая, какая я яростная, всю правду тебе выразила. Митей забавлялась, чтобы к тому не бежать». Alyosha differs from both his brother Ivan and Katerina Ivanovna because he can see not only into a person's words, but into their psychological and emotional makeup. Just as he triggered an insulting response from Katerina Ivanovna, "You little holy fool," «Вы маленький юродивый», he triggers a cutting answer from Rakitin. «Да ты влюбился в нее, что ли? Аграфена Александровна, ведь постник-то наш и впрямь в тебя влюбился. Победила!» — прокричал он с наглым смехом. It is a distinctly Dostoevskian concept that faith is a most powerful armament in the crucible of doubt, and it is the faith that Alyosha expresses in Grushenka that leads him to the miracle of the Cana of Galilee in the subsequent chapter. The word «машинально» is repeated twice to describe Alyosha leaving Grushenka's house. Alyosha дал себя машинально вывести. Он был как бы в забытии, шел машинально. Which highlights that Alyosha is actually led to his epiphany by some unknown internal force. The fact that his mind is elsewhere opens the door to a suggestion that it is his soul leading him to the monastery. His soul being in control validates the viewpoint that this unusual epiphanic experience is sourced from his internal sense of self rather than from any external ideal. Division of the mind between the soul. Alyosha's automatic, goal-driven walk aligns him with the bold, firm strides which characterize the directness of Dmitri's nature, as Terrace has pointed out. Quoting Richard Pace, Terrace furthermore underlines that the walk of Alyosha and Dmitri places them further away from Ivan, whose gait seems to be a hint at his intellectual shuffling. Брат Иван идет как-то раскачиваясь, и что у него правое плечо, если сзади глядеть, кажется ниже левого. This running comparison reinforces the growing division between the type of characters who convince themselves of the validity of an external ideal and those who base their life upon an internal vision, sourced from a personal memory. Filled with sadness to his very core, Alyosha reminisces about his elder Zosima's voice when he receives his life-changing inspiration. And this is the next, and I believe the last quote on the slides for you. Полная восторгом душа его жаждала свободы, места, широты. Над ним широко, необозримо опрокинулся небесный купол, полный тихих и сияющих звезд. Алеша стоял, смотрел и вдруг, как подкошенный, повергся на землю. Он не знал, для чего он обнимал ее. Он не давал себе отчета, почему ему так неудержимо хотелось целовать ее. Простить хотелось ему всех и за все, и просить прощения. О, не себе, а за всех, за все и за вся. Но с каждым мгновением он чувствовал ясно и как бы осязательно, как что-то твердое и незыблемое, как этот свод небесный сходило в душу его, какая-то как бы идея воцарялась в уме его. И уже на всю жизнь и на веки веков, через 3 дня он вышел из монастыря. The time and place of this experience supports the idea that an epiphanic vision is also a sort of mental nadrif in the soul. What we need to underline, however, is that while the nadrif in Ivan and Katerina Ivanovna's cases leaves them more adrift, Alyosha's nadrif intensifies his mental state. He experiences an undeniable ecstasy that suffuses him with a new, authentic spiritual meaning. Many feelings of uncertainty surround this scene that may undermine or question the authenticity of this experience and the character of this very different nadrif. We suppose Alyosha's nadrif culminates in an epiphany because he has not attached himself to an external, unbendable ideal like the others have. He maintains this confidence in his internal, flexible idea, needing only a sign to justify dedicating his life to it completely. The power of epiphanic experience is based on a strong connection to a very important personal memory. Dostoevsky underlines that such memories can be remembered, everyone knows this, even from an earlier age, even from the age of 2. And for Alyosha, this memory was of his mother praying for him. An open window, the slanting rays of the setting sun, an icon in the corner of the room, and before the icon on her knees, his mother sobbing and praying for him to the Mother of God. If the internal idea of one group is based on a deeply seated memory, something that effectively comes from within the person, then the external ideal is inevitably sourced from the person's outside surroundings. Characters strain in their attempt to pursue this external ideal because they cannot live by it, but only try to emulate it, keeping their conscience in constant check. Now, in conclusion, Alyosha knew he needed to leave the monastery before his epiphany. However, the epiphany fueled this possible future with the meaning necessary for him. It has brought with it a sense of vocation, the delineations of which are yet to unfold. One might thus infer that the epiphanic experience places an air of divine or spiritual approval on an idea that a person has already construed for themselves, making it internal and sourced from the person's soul rather than from the mind. Through his epiphanic experiences, Alyosha becomes an internally driven character who has a moral and spiritual backbone, making him the bearer of an idea, a well-defined philosophy that is engulfed by a distinctly Russian kind of spirituality, as Rachel Wood underlines. Alyosha's strong creed in his personal memory stands opposed to this second group of characters, which I have argued to be Fyodor Pavlovich, Ivan Karamazov, and as well a secondary character, Katerina Ivanovna Verkhovtsov. The decision to pursue an external ideal is inevitably a flawed one in Dostoevsky's world. It comes as a result of a character's active denial of their internal world, whether it be due to shame, as in Katerina Ivanovna's case, or the refusal to accept faith as legitimate in Ivan's. These characters are doomed to spend their lives trying to emulate ideal virtuousness, ideal intellectualism, rendering them completely dependent on others' perceptions of them. Katerina and Ivan's voluntary mutual rejection of a future together underlines how convinced they are about the righteousness of their vision. Consequently, all Dostoevsky's characters are indeed people of an idea. This idea drives their life spirit and invigorates their reality. However, a character's idea can only be internal, sourced from a deeply seated personal memory. A character's obsession with an idea that is external, be it wickedness, intellectualism, or pride, becomes inevitably an ideal that a character may chase but never genuinely live out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, very interesting paper. I think that these three papers are going to be all very different approaches to the Brothers Karamazov. So I think that we'll have some good discussion at the end. Okay, the next paper is going to be presented by Liza Shershneva of the University of Toronto, and her paper is entitled Disillusionment in Post-Reform Justice, Literary and Public Discourse in Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. Okay, Liza, go for it.
Thank you so much, Professor Holland. 1 second, I'll share my screen. Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
So, hi everyone. Today I will present my work on literary and public discourse in Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. Both novels' narrative are centered around the murder and its investigation. So we will compare how this process is represented in both texts and how it shows Dostoevsky's shift in the views on justice and literary discourse. So I would start with the little context providing. For us, for this topic, it is important to mention Dostoevsky's journalistic background. During 60s, many writers were published in Sikh journals. They published not only articles but also fictional texts. And Dostoevsky had his own Sikh journals, Time and Later Epoch, and they were his way of sharing his political and social views with the public. His Sikh journals were ideologically aimed to the unification of the common folk and intellectuals. So during the early 60s, it was a period of weakening of censorship legislation when the number of periodicals increased significantly. And until 1862, disorganized state censorship led authors to express their opinions on the proper organization of the censorship apparatus. So writers tried to find the limits of what is permitted and developed the concept of glasnost and the concept of public opinion to gain control over the written word. And also the concept of glasnost is predominantly associated with the perestroika period, but it actually was invented in the second half of the 19th century. And for Dostoevsky himself, literary control over the public sphere through glasnost was an ideal structural principle of the society. So despite writers' numerous attempts to develop common views on glasnost, their statements turned out to contradict each other. So the hopes for significant changes were lost after the finalization of censorship changes in 1865. But even after the closure of his second journal, Epoch, Dostoevsky stuck to this belief in glasnost for some time, but he gradually, after 65, started to lose his hopes. And here we see the cute quote by Dostoevsky where glasnost is represented as a child, which will take literary discourse and governmental apparatus to a brighter future when he will grow up. The second thing that should be mentioned here is a judicial reform, which has taken place in 1864, and on the slide you can see the difference it made. Glasnost and the new courts created a completely different social approach to justice. Juries and attorneys became the center of public attention, and Dostoevsky, in his writer's diary, praised the new system during the 60s, but by the 70s, he thought that juries frequently acquitted too readily, lawyers were unfaithful, and the courts as an institution had taken the wrong path. We should know that for Dostoevsky, according to his writer's diary and articles from his both journals, both the acknowledgement of sin and the collective guilt, as well as its reasonable forgiveness, are important. It's the most important things for him. That's how justice should function. So now we are finally get to our primary sources, and the Crime and Punishment, as we can see, was written in 1866 when censorship rules were already discussed and published. So we can see that justice in Crime and Punishment is a little bit messy, but still people are seeking the truth, which is absolutely not the case in the Brothers Karamazov, which was published in 1880s. Its settings, however, combines the historical features of the whole period after the beginning of the Great Reform. So we can say that Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov narratives are taking place in the same time. So here we can see this Dostoevsky shift from the inspiration from Glasnost and new courts to the full disillusionment in them. And we will start with the preliminary investigation in Crime and Punishment. And we can see from this conversation of Razumikhin and Zosimov that society is somehow lost and people don't understand how the new justice system functions. Razumikhin doesn't understand what Porfiry Petrovich is doing, and Zosimov is somehow indifferent about it because he sees him as a government official and doesn't have a belief in him. However, they are willing to participate, and the characters are reading about the crime and periodicals and actively discussing it and searching for the true criminal. Preliminary investigation in Crime and Punishment is quite long, since the officials are really seeking for the truth, and the accent is on the search for the criminal and his redemption. So we can see that Porfiry Petrovich is kind of a prototype of the elder Zosima. However, the quotes from Gospels given to the government official, which is interesting in the situation. We know that Porfiry Petrovich has 3 conversations with Raskolnikov, and each of them brings him closer to accepting his guilt and his punishment. Vladimir Goldstein shows that he acts as a spiritual midwife, helping Raskolnikov to be reborn. So we have seen the intellectuals' reaction on the crime. We see how government officials functioning, and also we have here a representative of Narod, the common folk. It's Mikolka. He also doesn't understand modern courts, of course, and he is frightened by the government. He even was ready to commit suicide when he was blamed, he was accused. But he serves in the capacity that Dostoevsky envisions for the common people, take the communal guilt on himself and accept suffering. So he is not yet fully developed as a member of society, but possesses the impulse toward the truth, which is for Dostoevsky important feature of Narod. Thus, the investigation became not just a judicial, but a moral procedure in Crime and Punishment. And here we can see the quintessential moment, the pure expression of Dostoevsky's ideas on glasnost's interaction with justice. So truthful ideas in open press should prevail over falsehoods, according to Dostoevsky, and also according to him, the dangerous ideas will be self-exposing. And Raskolnikov is a demonstration of that. The justice is inescapable, and we can see this on through the quote from the slide. The publisher was closed, but unknowingly for Raskolnikov, the article was published in another newspaper. And this article helped Porfiry Petrovich to understand true motives on Raskolnikov and help him to accept his guilt, to take him to redemption. And actually, all of this is not the case, absolutely not the case in the brothers Karamazov. The preliminary investigation here is compressed into one evening, and the government officials have already agreed on a criminal and spent time accusing him according to the procedure. Here we see the importance of officials' personal interests, their appearance, their personal lives, and their characters which lead them to accuse their own person. They start the investigation as a mere discussion of gossip, which is paralleled with a vulgarized state of glasnost, reduced to gossip talk during the period, the end of the 60s. And collective guilt, of course, is not the case here. So thus their discourse and Mitya's discourse are absolutely different. They have dry bureaucratic discourse of investigation, and it wins over Mitya's sincerity and meaningful conversation cannot occur between them. So contrasting to three discussions of Raskolnikov with Porfiry Petrovich, which led him to confession, we can see Mitya undergoes three mытарства, which is in Orthodox tradition a post-mortem torture of a soul by evil spirits, and investigators here are represented as demons. So during this conversation, Mitya becomes so angry that he doesn't even want to tell about his pity towards Grigory he has hit. And in the end, they make him a criminal, not only like according to papers, but metaphorically, forcefully changing him in other clothes. So we know that Mitya is not the criminal for the whole novel. But we know that Smerdyakov is the one who killed the father. And Smerdyakov wants to blame the environment, Sreda, in his murder. So he says to Ivan, you killed, you are the main murderer, and I was only your henchman, faithful Licharda, and at your word, I did this. So it's ironic that Licharda from the tale of both the prince is a traitor and antithesis of the loyal servant. But it is true that Ivan is the one who is retranslator of the contemporary literary discursive ideas. And in book 9, Ivan finds the metaphysical criminal, naked essence of the ideas that led to the murder in the form of the devil appearing to him. Ivan's nightmare chapter is filled with journalistic discourse. The working practices are mentioned numerous times, and the styles of feuilletons, anecdotes, journal sketches, as well as fashionable and vulgar expressions such as Bratya Slavyani, which were fashionable during 70s, they are frequently used. So the devil says about himself that he was assigned to deny, which is for Dostoevsky is the greatest literary sin, the nihilism. And also he proceeds to name himself directly an author of the column of criticism of some metaphysical journal of existence. Well, they chose a scapegoat, forced me to write in the column of criticism, and life came into being, says the devil. So also I want to point to draw your attention on the devil's appearance, a kind of decency with very little pocket money. So that parallels with the situation with the literature, something that should be decent, but with really limited possibilities. And this clause is also out of fashion, which corresponds with the state of glasnost on the period of writing. But we also can see the devil as pretty ambiguous figure because there are truthful ideas in literary discourse, but they merge with the plethora of banal and dangerous ones, as we can see in the last quote. The second important figure here is Rakitin as a living representation of the same column of criticism, according to Ivan and Alyosha. Rakitin attempts to seduce Alyosha, make him more like a demonic figure. And there is a pretty ironic parallel between Devil and Rakitin. Devil accuses Ivan of waiting for another less vulgar sort of devil, and Rakitin accuses Alyosha of waiting for another god who would behave differently, the one who will sanctify the corpse of Zosima. And also Rakitin has this journalistic feeling, and he predicts the future murder with a structure of detective story and sense of scandal, which is a mockery of Zosima's prophecy. But here only imagines Dmitri as a murderer, while Zosima sees his true burden. And indeed, Rakitin's explanation upholds all the standards of contemporary journalism. It is sensational, vulgar, rationalistic, and leaving no place for higher religion and emotional forces. In the end, both Rakitin and the governmental investigators come to the same conclusion to blame their own person, but Rakitin didn't even need investigation for this. So now we will move to courts, which are the logical conclusion of the truth-seeking process in both novels. And in Crime and Punishment, preliminary investigation and glasnost have already led to justice being established. The real murderer is found and is really ready to acknowledge his guilt, so we don't need a detailed description of the court process. While in the brothers Karamazov, preliminary investigation and literary discourse led to false accusation, and the court is like a theatrical act, the purpose of which is to accuse the innocent. So we have the detailed description of it. In Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky retells the attempts to give their fashionable mental explanation of Raskolnikov's crime, but he rejects all of them. And the jury is not interested in it. What interests the jury are the stories about Raskolnikov, stories of Raskolnikov's friend and people who knows him, and their description of his personality and past deeds. So in the Brothers Karamazov, the stories of doctors, attorneys, and other people who knew Mitya are perceived as new acts in spectacle. Government officials are not interested in truth, and public and journalists are interested in a good show. And in Crime and Punishment for Raskolnikov, the punishment is shortened to 8 years. The main idea of Dostoevsky is realized. The court accuses the murderer, but is not harsh to him because they caught a feeling of this collective guilt. However, in the Brothers Karamazov, by the end of the trial, Mitya's guilt is not important anymore, as the attention shifts to the question of patricide. The jury says that the killing of the fathers is not permissible and puts an innocent in jail after like an answer of this question. So actually, here I have a table of my conclusions, but in more systematic way. Here we can see that Dostoevsky was extremely disillusioned in the concept of glasnost, public opinion, and the new laws of justice. And shared this opinion through the novels he has written, and depicts the system. And in Crime and Punishment, he was trying to find the essence of the truth and the future hope for catching justice, while in The Brothers Karamazov, he shows us how it turned out in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Liza. Perfect timing there. Lots of questions and lots of interest, but first we're going to have our third.
You muted yourself.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So yeah, last but not least, and let me actually remove the spotlight from Liza. Last but not least is our final paper, which will be given by Alina Fiorella, who's an independent scholar, formerly of the University of Bristol, and the Grand Inquisitor's Russian double, Father Zosima Beyond Dostoevsky's Authorial Intent. So please go ahead, Alina.
Okay, thank you. Just a moment. Oh. Is my slide visible?
Yes.
Yes.
So the Grand Inquisitor's Russian double, reading Father Zosima Beyond Dostoevsky's Authorial Intent. The predominant focus on the relationship between Dostoevsky's authorial intent and his controversial portrayal of Christianity in The Russian Monk has generated outstanding studies on both sides of the scholarly debate, framed by pro and contra perspectives regarding the novel's central dilemma of atheism versus faith and socialism versus Christianity. However, the recent decline in critical interest in the question concerning the exact nature of Zosima's faith indicates that this binary discourse has exhausted its rich utility. This suggests a need for a new, dynamic approach, one that neither affirms Zosima's faith nor celebrates Ivan's Grand Inquisitor, but instead redefines the terms of the debate by moving beyond the issue of Dostoevsky's authorial intent toward a fresh reconceptualization of Zosima's role in Dostoevsky's novel. I argue that in The Brothers K, Father Zosima functions as the Grand Inquisitor's Russian double, unmasking the image of Russian revolutionary socialism as an atheistic false religion and the continuation of Russian imperialism by other means, an idea that Zosima's character implicitly elaborates. Central to my claim is the figure of the impostor as a mediator of this proposed relationship and a site where the binary opposition between socialism and Christianity, revolution and imperialism deconstructs itself. My main argument is informed by three reference points. The early interpretations of Zosima as a covert preacher of socialism, the ideological continuities between the Grand Inquisitor and Zosima highlighted in recent scholarship, and Dostoevsky's favored device of the double. By examining Dostoevsky's literary canon alongside his stated authorial intent, my intertext-sensitive reading reveals that the answer to the question of Zosima's religious faith lies not in the binary opposition between socialism and Christianity, atheism and faith, but in their dynamic intersections. One veiled allusion to imposture related to Zosima hovers over the narrator's postscript to The Russian Monk. The first line, "Here ends the manuscript of Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov," almost verbatim reproduces the narrator's addendum to Pushkin's seminal tale of imposture, The Captain's Daughter, which similarly begins with the words, "Here end the notes of Pyotr Andreevich Grinev." This structural intertextuality is hardly surprising, given the well-documented influence of Pushkin's work on Dostoevsky's literary life. However, to my knowledge, this particular dialogue between Pushkin's and Dostoevsky's text has not yet merited critical attention. And it does merit critical attention, for it frames the elder's vita in relation to the Russian literary and socio-historical tradition of imposture in general, and Zosima's character in relation to the figure of the impostor in particular. That is, by explicitly analogizing Alyosha to Grinyov, the historian of Pugachev's rebellion, it positions Alyosha in the role of Zosima's chronicler, thus implicitly analogizing the elder to the figure of Pushkin's impostor rebel. One discovers another Pushkin link connecting Zosima to imposture in a chapter titled Peasant Women Who Have Faith. Many readers, following the novel's stated core focus on the antagonistic relationship between atheism and faith, have read it as Dostoevsky's sharp counterpoint to the adjacent chapter, A Lady with Little Faith, often centering their critical forces on praising the Russian peasant's faith and conversely mocking the apparently faithless Madame Khaklakova. However, upon scrutiny, such an ideological reading of this chapter proves misleading, diverting critics' attention from its dramatic resemblance to the scene at Vishnevetsky's from Pushkin's Boris Godunov, which sees the first false Dmitri, much like Zosima in the scene under consideration, in the act of receiving and interacting with supplicants. In her analysis of the Pushkin scene, Carol Emerson highlights Dmitri's golden effect on his petitioners, crediting it to his ability to create himself in their image and liking of him by promising each precisely what they ask in exchange for respect and support. Similarly, in his interactions with the peasant women, Zosima reflects their needs, desires, and expectations. Similarly, he exerts the same halo effect on them all. He comforts an anxious mother by reassuring her that she will soon hear from her missing son, which she eventually does, validates the feelings of a woman mourning the loss of her little boy and shows her how to navigate grief, alleviates another's fear of death, and performs a miraculous healing of a hysterical woman, which prompts some members of the nearby crowd to worship at Zosima's feet. Pretenders, writes Emerson, took on other people's hopes and allowed them, for a time, to flourish. However, instead of distancing the elder and his miraculous deeds from Pushkin's royal impostor and his maneuvering for power and status, Dostoevsky's text leans into the imposture connection by offering, no sooner than the first miracle has occurred, and seemingly for no discernible reason, that miraculous healings may often result from malingering and trickery of the clericals, implying, in rather crude terms, the potentially staged nature of the healing event. This suggestion, in turn, undermines the authenticity of Zosima's encounters with the peasant women, casting doubt on his purported likeness to a Russian monastic saint. More importantly, for my purposes, the Pushkin inner text further distances Zosima from his appointed role of Russia's spiritual healer by framing the narrator's footnote to the miraculous healing with the thematics of imposture. As a result, the seemingly unmotivated content takes on concrete form, thereby bringing, on the one hand, the figure of the Russian monk into the orbit of the Grand Inquisitor's modus operandi of miracle, mystery, and authority, and on the other, framing the character of Father Zosima, once again, in relation to the Russian literary and socio-historical tradition of imposture. The invocation of the impostor in the context of Zosima's Vita particularly suggests the elder as an impostor saint, a notion supported by Zosima's failed sainthood test known as the Order of Corruption. Simultaneously, by embedding this suggested religious imposture within the iconography of the Russian rebellion, Dostoevsky's text implicitly places Zosima under the banner of Russian revolutionary radicalism raised by Ivan and the Grand Inquisitor in the critical chapters of the novel. In fact, by creating a symbolically charged overlap between religion, revolutionary socialism, and imposture, Dostoevsky's text situates the figure of the Russian monk within the context of the very blasphemy that Dostoevsky sought to refute, raising the question of Zosima's identity. So, who is the Russian monk, and what is his significance in Dostoevsky's novel? I argue that the figure of the Russian monk presents an image of Russian revolutionary socialism as an underground emperor who conceals his will to power behind the mask of the reformed Christ of universal brotherhood and love, essentially an imposter saint. To bridge the conceptual gap between Dostoevsky's ideal Christian and the member of the ancient religious institution to proponent of the fundamentally atheistic ideology or a fraudulent Christian, I offer you Dostoevsky's statement from the 1870s as a theoretical springboard. 1. The monks, those are the socialists, believers to the point of madness. They are nihilists, even elevated the negation of religion to the status of religion. Their nihilism is but passionate faith. These are the forever praying, the monks, and the hymnics. 2. Socialism is Christianity too, but it wants to do it by way of reason. 3. Socialism, the seemingly passionate and fatal rebellion against the Catholic idea, is nothing more than the most faithful and committed continuation of the Catholic idea, with the figure of the Grand Inquisitor presenting an epic example of Dostoevsky's case in point. One thing these statements so effectively accomplish is showing that Dostoevsky uses the term monks as an epithet for socialists and nihilists. Simultaneously, contrary to prevailing views, they capture Dostoevsky's perspective on socialism not as the antithesis of Christianity, but as a form of faith rooted in unbelief. However, while Western socialism is inherently atheistic, Russian socialism, or the form atheism took in pre-revolutionary Russia, is entirely religious. Indeed, this radical secular religiosity, full of sound and fury, yet revealing nothing but nihilism at its core, characterizes, constitutes, and defines the Russian aspect of the revolutionary socialism in the Brothers K. It's the national trait, the ironic devil in Ivan's nightmare, and the facet of the Russian monk that Zosima conceals and the imposter ultimately reveals. However, if Dostoevsky's Russian socialism is an imposter religion presenting as Christianity, how can one distinguish between the original and the fake, the pure ideal Christian of Dostoevsky's imagination, and the demonic Grand Inquisitor who appears on the novel's stage clad in monastic robes? In a Russian historical tradition of imposture, one must search for the royal marks. In Dostoevsky's fiction, the royal mark and the distinction between a true and a false Christian hinge on whether one believes in God. For, to quote from Dostoevsky's text, socialism is before all things the atheistic question, the question of the Tower of Babel built without God. Susan McReynolds has already noted the striking similarities between the conceptions of God held by Zosima, Ivan, and the Grand Inquisitor. My intention here is not to restate these views in my own words. Instead, I aim to illustrate how deeply rooted Zosima is in what I describe as Dostoevsky's iconography of literary atheism, a stable system of signs by which Dostoevsky marks his literary socialists, nihilists, and atheists. In short, his ideologically possessed devils. According to Leatherbarrow, in Dostoevsky's fiction, details of physical character description serve a symbolic function of betraying the inner spiritual world. In that case, Zosima's physical description deserves the first look. Dostoevsky writes, "His face was very thin and covered with fine wrinkles, particularly numerous about his eyes, which were small and shining like two bright points. His pointed beard was small and scanty, and his lips, which smiled frequently, were as thin as two threads. His nose was sharp, like a bird's beak. Immediately, we notice the similarity between Zosima's face and the smiling mask, suggested by his frequently smiling lips and the complementary fine wrinkles around his eyes. In turn, the mask both objectifies and externalizes the issue of Zosima's identity while inviting an intertextual parallel with Stavrogin, Dostoevsky's literary demon characterized by his mask-like face and signature nihilism. At the same time, the mask extends this parallel, again, to the real-life royal impostor and runaway monk Grigory Atrepiev, with whom Stavrogin is identified textually. In one stroke, Dostoevsky's intertextual pen adorns Zosima's mask of the radiant saint with the dual images of the devil and the impostor monk, crafting this complex imagery against the highly charged symbolic background of demons. In this book of impostors, Dostoevsky famously reveals Russian revolutionary socialism as a devil figure in human form and with a distinct ideological identity. Zosima's sharp, beak-like nose unpacks this identity by placing the elder among Dostoevsky's other bird-themed characters, such as Lebyadkin, Lebedev, Ptitsin, Ivolgin, and Gaganov. According to Leatherbarrow's study of the demonic in Dostoevsky's major fiction, Dostoevsky's bird names serve as a symbolic link between the unclean and hateful birds of fallen biblical Babylon and the enlightened devils of socialism, nihilism, and atheism, indicating the fallen spiritual state of 19th century Europeanized Russia, with Father Zosima, in this instance, appearing as its sign and symbol. Further, Zosima's portrait continues to engage the demonic aspect of his characterization by establishing a parallel relationship with the facial description of Dostoevsky's chief revolutionary devil, the resident of the birdhouses, and the metaphorical son of Peter the Great, Pyotr Verkhovensky. Verkhovensky's bird significations not only mark him as an unmistakable devil figure, but also trace the origins and unique character of Russian revolutionary socialism back to Peter's radical westernization and secularization of Russian society, along with his imperialist ambitions rooted in Roman ideals. Quote, "Listen, the Pope will be in the West, and we will have you," end quote, Verkhovensky declares to Stavrogin, unveiling his revolutionary project as merely a Russian variant of the Catholic idea, and as a historical and ideological successor to Russian imperialism. In this context, examining Zosima's teachings on love proves to be insightful. The elder states, quote, "One stands perplexed, especially at the sight of men's sin, and wonders whether one should use force or humble love. Always decide to use humble love. If you resolve on that once and for all, you may subdue the whole world. Loving humility is marvelously strong, the strongest of all things, and there is nothing else like it," end quote. What stands out in this passage is Zosima's perspective on love as a potent instrument of power and domination, capable of subduing, not uniting, the entire world. This confession reveals the elder's hidden desires for universal lordship and his enthusiasm for Roman rather than Russian Orthodox virtues. One cannot help but think that Zosima articulates a philosophy of power rather than in love in this statement. The difference between Verkhovensky's socialist agenda and Zosima universal brotherhood appears to be the difference between the means, not the ends. In humble love, Zosima seems to have discovered a unique source of miracle, mystery, and authority. Here's Verkhovensky's portrait. His features are small, eyes sharp, nose small and sharp, lips long and thin. Russian monk Zosima and Pyotr Verkhovensky, a self-identified crook, boast identical bird faces. Further still, the intertextual continuities between Zosima and Verkhovensky's appearances run beyond the facial likeness to other aspects of their characterizations. Both have unlikable faces and hunched backs, and both are imbued with a similar aura of duplicity. The perfectly healthy and strong Verkhovensky sports the look of a man recovering from a grave illness, whereas in Zosima's case, the strenuous relationship between appearance and reality is inverted. The elder's apparently thriving looks belong to a man suffering from a terminal and mysterious illness, the secret of which is known only to Zosima himself. The message is clear: Zosima is not what he seems. Here again, the elder finds himself situated in a context of symbolic meaning salient to Dostoevsky's iconography of literary atheism. As the unique properties of the devil, duplicitous appearances denote the presence of demonic qualities in a character. Likewise, sickness is a prominent motif in Dostoevsky's fiction, associated with the notorious devils of enlightenment. Quote, "Atheism is an aristocratic illness, an illness of higher education and learning," end quote, Dostoevsky wrote in his notebooks. If imposture is a native, chronic disease of the Russian state, the malaise of the underdog, atheism is an imported foreign disease that possesses the enlightened. It is no coincidence, then, that Dostoevsky's literary devils, including Stavrogin, Verkhovensky, and Ivan's devil himself, often manifest overt or covert symptoms of sickness and typically appear in pairs characterized by a distinct master-servant dynamic. When Western atheist ideologies are grafted onto existing domestic cultural and historical patterns, they produce the kind of Russian ideological devil that, for Dostoevsky, is the root cause of 19th century Russia's societal ills. And Zosima, in enlarged view, is not an exception. Time and again, Dostoevsky's text disrupts the connection between Zosima and Dostoevsky's alleged ideal Christian, forcing us instead to recognize his character as yet another, and arguably the most alluring and cunning emanation of the same meta-protagonist that haunts Dostoevsky's last two novels. Like the Grand Inquisitor and Dostoevsky's typical enlightened devil, Zosima does not believe in God, not a bit of it. That is his whole secret, the secret of his sickness and the order of corruption. And if Zosima does not believe in God, he cannot be considered a true Christian. In an intertextual dynamic between Zosima and Verkhovensky, Dostoevsky's text objectifies the internal duality of the imposter figure, allowing for removing the tension between atheism and faith, socialism and imperialism, revolution and religion. This leads me back to my starting point. The character of the Russian monk represents a distinct type of hagiographic hero, an imposter saint, and here Zosima enters the realm of Ivan and his Roman double, the Grand Inquisitor. It becomes evident that Dostoevsky's last novel is not merely about the ideological struggle between atheism and faith with a clear victor. Rather, it narrates the origin story, paints a psychological portrait, and offers a biting critique of Russian revolutionary socialism as an atheistic false religion and the continuation of the Russian imperial impostorship plot by other means. As a historical product of the Russian Enlightenment, revolutionary socialism inevitably replicates and impersonates its imperial predecessor. And here I argue, Dostoevsky's critique of Russian socialism reveals itself as a veiled critique of Russian imperialism itself. Appearing under the banner of rebellion, the figure of the impostor stands as a mirror to the self-proclaimed nature of secular autocratic power and a symbol of Russian political history itself. And herein lies the significance and truly revolutionary aspect of The Russian Monk, the discovery of a seminal critique of socialism in the brothers Karamazov as a tool of anti-imperial deconstruction, which is far more radical than previous studies recognize, with Dostoevsky, once again, emerging as our great contemporary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina. So, three more great papers. So I have questions for all of you, but I am the chair of the panel as well. So I'd like to first give the audience the chance to ask any questions, or any of you to ask questions of each other. So if you'd like to ask a question, just either indicate with your hand or something in the chat. Or otherwise, if no one's going to come forward, I can also start by asking a few questions. So these three papers all, perhaps to a greater and lesser extent, kind of disrupt the ways that we think about the brothers Karamazov, and perhaps Alina's most of all, with the idea that Father Zosima is in fact an imposter. But I wanted to start out, I'm going to go in chronological order. I have a question for each of you, so I'm going to be a little bit more of a discussant right now. So I wanted to start with Nikolai's paper. So this idea of the nadriv, which is kind of key to book 4, and you provide a kind of a nice analogy of the different, this very untranslatable word, nadriv, the different kind of forms of nadriv that we see in that chapter. I wanted to ask you about one particular word that you used, or one particular word that you picked out in connection with Alyosha, which is the idea of machinalna, right? And you talked about that as kind of evidence that maybe he's not being led there by his head, but rather by his soul or something. But machinalna might also be seen as something kind of darker, right? Something more rationalistic. And for instance, I'm thinking about sort of the way in which it's used in Crime and Punishment, right? The other text that Liza was thinking about, that like Raskolnikov often kind of on his way to the murder, right? The murder kind of takes place as if he's part of a machine, right? So in that sense, machinalna might be associated with a kind of a less positive sort of spin on that situation. So I wanted to sort of ask you to kind of think through a little bit more that sort of what that might mean for you, and also about how this and then kind of by extension how a little bit more about what the Nadriv section or book 4 means for you, and kind of how it serves as a kind of key to this kind of redemptive moment that we see with Alyosha in the Cana of Galilee. And maybe I'll just ask all the questions like I would if I was a discussant, and then I'll give you the chance to answer them in turn. Liza, that was a great paper. One of the things I wanted to kind of ask you about is the kind of comparison of the two trials. What surprised me a little bit is kind of the positive spin that you give on the trial in Crime and Punishment. So the trial is kind of dispensed with right away in the first part of the epilogue to Crime and Punishment. And it seemed as though you were sort of arguing that the trial kind of functions in a sort of let's say that it works properly, right? That there's not too many problems with the trial in Crime and Punishment. But the problem is that also Raskolnikov basically kind of agrees to a sort of misrepresentation of his crime, right? So he kind of allows his crime to be presented as something much more mundane. So I was wondering sort of how that might fit with your idea. Overall, I'm generally very much in agreement with you in terms of the changes in Dostoevsky's kind of conception of how judicial discourse and sort of the effects of the great reforms, how there's a real shift from Crime and Punishment to the Brothers Karamazov. But I just wanted to sort of ask about that particular point that you were making. And then Alina, I wanted to to ask you, so in the context of this kind of provocative reading of Father Zosima, I wanted to ask you about something which often is kind of, so often students find it very perplexing or difficult to conceive of, the idea that Dostoevsky might have been thinking of a sequel to the Brothers Karamazov. We often kind of talk about that, and the sort of the idea that maybe Alyosha Karamazov would be a socialist, right? Maybe even a regicide, right? And so, yeah, with your reading of the novel, it seemed of what perhaps the first part of the Brothers Karamazov, it actually seems much more conceivable as a direction that he might have gone. So without wanting to necessarily accept the idea that that he did plan on writing a sequel, just wondering what you thought about that. And then, so if you could maybe in turn answer those questions, and then after that, if anyone else has questions that they'd like to ask the speakers, please go ahead and do it.
Yeah, very interesting point that you raised, Kate. I kind of even forgot about it being mentioned in Crime and Punishment. Let me try to delineate how I understand Nadriv first, and then I'll move over to Mashinalna. So what I find particularly interesting about the Nadriv is that it happens both in the characters who, in my opinion, follow an external ideal, and those that choose to follow their internal idea, right? So it exists in both situations. It doesn't, it's not a kind of preferential situation for the character with the internal idea, which I believe is, the preferred character by Dostoevsky. And what it symbolizes is this state of mental intensification where so many things tend to happen at once, where a character, at one point where it reaches that tipping point, everything clears out. And that is what I really see in Alyosha and this Mashinalna situation, where he has all these challenges, right, before he arrives at Grushenka's home. And then he has this very difficult conversation with Grushenka and Rakitin, where he essentially, but actually jumping to Liza's presentation, what I think exemplifies glasnost on the individual level, where he searches to speak the truth, and he says, nobody speaks the truth, but I need to get it out of me. And when at this moment when everything clears out, it is sort of that a character targets this thing that is deep in his soul, and he just follows it, without any outside influences, without any influences of the srida. He follows what is deep inside of him. So I do believe in this moment the Mashinalna symbolizes either him being led by some sort of unseen power, or him following that part of him in his soul that he wasn't able to exactly pinpoint initially, because as we know, Zosima did tell him to leave the monastery, but he didn't want to, right? And at this moment where he allows himself to be Mashinalna led out and follow that which he needs to do, he gains the necessary validation to make that his vocation. As well. And now that I'm saying these things, I do have a couple questions for other presenters, so I'll follow that up after their answers. Thank you.
Great. Liza, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it's an interesting question, but what I wanted to say during the presentation, the court in a Crime and Punishment represents the state of the court during 60s, where Narod is not is not ready to accept the truth and understand this kinda. And also Raskolnikov himself doesn't want to share this information with them. So for us, it's a productive court in terms of Porfiry Petrovich understood the true motive and helped Raskolnikov to come to understanding he is guilty and his idea was dangerous and awful. And he already kind of went through this part of the court with him, and jury are not ready to talk on these topics because glasnost is still not in its true progress, but they can do what narod should do in being in their place, to acknowledge the sin and to forgive it. So basically, yeah, it of course should have been pointed out by me that I meant here that they are fulfilling their duties and functioning as a truthful court, but not yet ready to the court in its true, pure form that Dostoevsky see it.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Yeah, thanks. I think you need to unmute. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, what I think about that alleged sequel, right? So, what do I think about it? Well, I think that arc is already present in the that arc for Alyosha specifically is already present in the novel, right? Specifically in his intimate friendship with Kolya Krasotkin, right? Toward the end of the novel, they really like develop this intimate relationship, right? Where on the first glance, it seems like it's kind of like Alyosha kind of like educating Kolya, so to speak. But I think that's a different type of relationship. I think they're almost positioned as doubles. Like one is the reflection of the other. And I think there is this idea, a certain acknowledgement given Kolya's physical beauty. There is a certain acknowledgement of the undeniable appeal of the socialist ideas. And so I think that arc for Alyosha is already present there. I think it almost, I don't want to say it comes to culmination, but like it's a celebration, like at the end, the final scene, right? It's the celebration almost like of the kind of like the new imposter, so to speak, right? The one that the people actually concede to rather than falling silent, like in Pushkin, for example.
Thanks. Okay, Anya Tropnikova has, I think.
I do. Thank you all for your magnificent presentations. I have a bit of a question for Alina. I was enchanted by this exploration of socialism, as like a potential new religion. It's kind of like what you're playing with here. And I'm thinking a lot about Pyotr Stepanovich in Biesy specifically, because, my impression from Biesy, I come away, despite Pyotr Verkhovensky, of course, saying это не то, after the murder of Shatov, I found the whole book to be this condemnation of socialism, actually, right? At least as expressed in the group of these radicals who end up carrying out this pointless murder, right? And each one of them is mistaken in a different way. But the trickiest figure for me is Pyotr Stepanovich. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about what you think Dostoevsky was trying to do with the figure of Pyotr Stepanovich. And maybe if we put aside a little bit of the whole apocalypse Biesy aspect of it with the pigs, and specifically as it concerns socialism. Thank you.
Pyotr Stepanovich is the patriarch.
No. He's the son of Stepan Trofimovich. He's the one who is kind of like the puppet master who manipulates everything. Oh, you're saying he's the patriarch.
Verkhovensky. You're talking about Verkhovensky.
Yeah.
Okay. So
not Verginsky, but Verkhovensky.
Right. You are talking about Verkhovensky.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you give me your question one more time then?
What is his role?
What is his role?
In terms of Dostoevsky's understanding of the benefits or the follies of socialism as a potential new religion that unifies society as a utopia. And Biese is this basically demonstration of the follies more than anything, right? So if that's the case, then how does that square with all of these socialist themes coming out from Zosima? You know, there's a little bit of a contradiction here, that there's tension between what Zosima is doing and between what Verkhovensky is doing in Biese. And I just want to hear a little bit more from you about maybe there's something that occurred in Dostoevsky's life that made him kind of come around on the idea. Just, I would love to hear your thoughts.
I don't see that as a contradiction. Okay, let me try to explain. So I think the way I see the figure of Verkhovensky, right, it's like an image of like revolutionary socialism as a fundamentally opportunistic and Machiavellian religion, right? That's how I read his character, right? He's not really like a revolutionary, so to speak. He uses this idea of rebellion and revolution, right, to stir up the trouble, as he thinks, right, because he has this power lust, right? He's lusting for power, right? And so he uses this idea of revolution and Stavrogin as his would-be imposter as an instrument to attaining those ends. Now, Verkhovensky is a very unappealing figure, right? And so I feel like in Demons, Dostoevsky's reveal the ugliness of that particular enterprise, right? He's like shouting at us from every corner, like it's, you know, don't go there. It's all a fake. It's deception. There is nothing undergirding these high-minded revolutionary ideals. Nothing. It's just a bunch of opportunists running around, right? So it's like pretty straightforward, so to speak. I think in The Brothers K, that's a slightly different project. I think Dostoevsky, well, I don't want to speak for Dostoevsky, right? But like the way I see it, I think that text presents specifically the alluring, the religious part of that Russian revolutionary socialism that in essence reveals nothing but nihilism, right? Like this passionate faith in nothing, right? And we have the passionate faith in the figure of Father Zosima. It's the nothing, right? Inside of it is what the imposter, in my view, reveals, right? We have the elevated talk of universal brotherhood and love and all these things, but I think the imposter really reveals basically the same thing that the demons do, right, for his other characters, right? Except I think the preoccupation in The Brothers K is with the attractiveness and the deceptive feel of the Russian revolutionary project that makes I think many readers have fallen for that, specifically because it's done so well.
Nikolai, did you want to ask your questions next?
Yeah, I have a question for both Liza and Alina. First of all, thank you so much for your presentations. It was really interesting to hear these ideas. First of all, for Liza, I've never heard about glasnost being used about Dostoevsky, so thank you for letting me know that. That's certainly a fact that nobody ever decided to tell me, neither in my bachelor's nor in my PhD program. What I'm thinking about here is how I usually approach at least the brothers Karamazov is as can be seen a little bit in my presentation, is like on the character level, on the individual level. And I agree with your arc of progression, how you see Dostoevsky's opinion on this develop from Crime and Punishment to the brothers Karamazov, where the court in the Brothers Karamazov is effectively a theater. But I wonder if this glasnost, this like his I don't know, support, interest in glasnost went away completely. Because in the character of Alyosha, as I previously mentioned, I see it there on the individual level. And due to I think, you know, Dostoevsky's propensity towards Alyosha as at times his spokesperson of his ideas in this novel, I wonder what you might think that that might signify, that this glasnost stopped being a political idea that encapsulates the collective and the community, but rather is kind of reduced to an individual level in one character. And for Alina, very interesting presentation. I never supposed, this could be possible, but at the same time, now that I'm thinking about it, I see it, especially with Zosima telling Alyosha that he needs to go out into the world, right? He needs to talk to people. Then he, as you mentioned, he starts talking to these children all the time, right? And then by the end of this book, basically, Alyosha is going to be some sort of like preacher towards everybody in the world, and he might be preaching these undercover socialist ideas. But what I wonder is how does this go sort of not unnoticed but undetected by the other characters in the book? Especially what interests me is that moment where they're in the monastery discussing Ivan's article, where Ivan talks about the church basically, what was it, taking back the criminal in their own hands because he has essentially nowhere to turn to, and Sima's opinions about that. So yeah, if you could just talk a little bit more about how Zosima's effect on Alyosha is noticeable, and these socialist ideas are transferred to him, and it's just peculiar to me that it's undetected. Thank you.
Thanks. So should we have Liza first and then Alina? Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for your question, and also for noticing that. Actually, for me, it was also a big surprise when I looking through Sikh journals during writing my bachelor thesis. I found out that glasnost was invented in the second half of 19th century, and it was widely used in Sikh journals, not only by Dostoevsky, but it was discussed in Современник, in Отечественные записки, and other Sikh journals, and not also a big publishers. So basically, for Dostoevsky, this idea was really extremely important. And in his journal Время, he was writing a lot about glasnost and its progress, and how he wants to see it in the future, how he sees the functions of it, and about its implementation. He had lots of discussions about it with other journals, and also they raised the question about the именная or неименная гласность, what it should be. So basically, for him, I would say that in my research, of course, I reduce everything to the level of structure, to the level of the structural narrative, and how the glasnost as a public political concept functions. So basically, of course, in these terms, this wouldn't go to the personal character level, but I would say that this disillusionment in glasnost and the concept of this of the Great Reform periods led Dostoevsky to put this kind of voice of truth in the characters themselves, and make them speak up, because he has no more hope for the literary discourse, Sikh journals, and stuff that he really passionately believed during the period of great reforms. So now he's searching for the new representatives of the truth seeking, and the character of Alyosha is a great example of this. So actually, he really changes characters which are around him, but it's important for me that during the court, he couldn't change anything because he is alone speaking the truth there. So basically, in terms of kind of political structure he represents in the Brothers Karamazov, he is lost, and he feels this disappointment in the term, but he feels that there are people who can speak up and change others on the personal level. Thank you.
Alina, go ahead.
Okay, so your question is about how come what I'm seeing goes unnoticed by other characters in the book, right? Okay. I do think that it does go very much noticed by other characters in the books. I think there is quite a number of characters that seem to go out of their way to tell us something about Zosima. Like, for example, let's start with Father Karamazov, right? I mean, like, he tells us constantly, like, he calls him a Jesuit, right? He compares him to Pechorin, right? Then he compares him to the Faustian devil figure, right? Then he tells us that no, he does not believe in God, not a bit of it, right? And of course, one may say, well, it's Father Karamazov, you know, what do you want from him? But it's like, we also know, I think there's enough scholarship that has shown that Dostoevsky uses his negative characters as vehicle for some of his most interesting ideas. So like that argument is not that easy to easily dispense with, right? Then we also have, for example, Musov, right? Who tells us in that scene, I think that you're describing, that we are not really afraid of those like atheists and revolutionaries, but we're really afraid of those Christian socialists, right? Like Christian socialists, right? Like clearly referring to Father Zosima and company, right? Now we also have Rakitin, again, another sort of negative character who actually interprets, who actually deciphers or actually acts as an interpreter of Zosima's bow to Dmitri, right? So he kind of interprets it and he tells for us, his audience, what it really means, which actually, for me, means that Zosima really doesn't have any deep insight, does not possess any gift of seeing at all, if his actions can be deciphered and the same thing can be seen by other characters in the novel. And I think Alyosha is also one who also deciphers that bow in the same way. So we have three different characters interpreting the same scene, which again, for my purposes, means that he really doesn't have any unique gift of seeing, you know, and a rather an average, kind of like ordinary devil, so to speak. Like as a sign of his ordinariness rather than his exceptionality.
And anybody else would like to ask a question? Yeah, Nikolai.
I follow up. Thank you very much for bringing up these points. I completely forgot about Miusov's interpretation of the bow. So what do we think about Father Firapont then? If this is how we if this is how we think about Zosima, because that you know, the what do you think? Does that change things about how we generally see Father Firapont, or?
No, I think no, I know like Father Firapont has been like demonized by many Dostoevsky's readers as if he were like a real person to actually demonize. It's very interesting in that way. But I think Father Firapont, I mean, like tells us in rather double-voiced language, if one wants to go there and like dig around and, you know, perform some hermeneutical digging, you know, we can learn quite a bit, right? Actually, like he accuses, I think, Zosima of eating candy, right? And like hanging out with women, right? Basically making this allegations that he's committing a certain thing unbefitting his position as the elder, right? And if we go inside the text, we can actually find evidence to prove that, but really not with the view to show that Zosima has like unbefitting like sexual relationships, but like to cast more consistent doubt on his figure of the celebrated elder.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
One comment to kind of bring this discussion also into Lisa's argument. I think that also, in a sense, where Dostoevsky is here is also in this new era where everything is slippery, where nothing really means what it seems to, where sort of stable semantic values are, in a sense, no longer existing because of the state of the kind of cultural and print changes and sort of and also loss of faith in the sort of reforms of the 60s. Liza, did you want to kind of come in here also from that point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm absolutely agree with what you just said. Basically, that's what I probably meant. So, for example, this kind of uncertainty about how to approach the truth in the contemporary situation, which is also the time period he is illustrating is not stable. It's kind of the lots of characteristic came together, lots of characteristic from early 60s to 70s, and he put them together to show this chaotic lost state of literary and public discourse. And also it's interesting to go further with the Alyosha character here. We can see that he tries to speak up and show the truth to others, but he doesn't have instruments to move the system in the end. So basically, this kind of sequel about Alyosha becoming a socialist is an interesting move there to give them this kind of new instruments to speak up and search for the truth.
So anybody want to ask any other questions? Yeah, Alina.
Yeah, I have for Nikolai. So you talked about Karamazov Senior's buffoonery, right? How do you really interpret that exhibitionist behavior? Like, what do you really make of it? Like, what function does that behavior serve in your view, especially in the context of that scene, right, where he's just like, flailing himself before Zosima's court, so to speak?
My opinion on Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, he's an interesting character because he, at the same time, we're absolutely revolted reading about him and his actions, but at the same time, we're kind of intrigued and we want to know more about him, and we're given these like little bits of pieces of his past and how he kind of became what he is, but. What I believe his buffoonery is targeted at is provocation. It's a provocation of other characters, and I really, if we want to boil it down to like a formalist analysis, I think it's kind of a literary device on Dostoevsky's part. In most Dostoevsky's novels, there's this moment, right, where everything's kind of boiling, and then there's this sort of eruption, and there's a character, a literary device, essentially, who aids in that. And I believe Fyodor Pavlovich's replicas and the ideas he espouses are used to get these replicas out of Alyosha, out of Ivan, out of Dmitri, to really expose their selfhoods and provoke their character development, right? So when Ivan talks about God, we see the reply from Alyosha, and we understand more about his character and his selfhood and the idea that he holds within himself, right? While we never really understand what he says that he follows this philosophy of wickedness, but I think he follows numerous different philosophies and he follows numerous different ideals, not even truly, but solely for the purpose of provoking other characters, and in that way, allowing the reader to understand what ideas or ideals, as I argue, these characters hold true to themselves. Yeah.
Okay, a follow-up, if I may.
Sure.
Okay. So, then why do you think no reconciliation between Karamazov's father and his sons happen inside Zosima's cell? Because remember, the whole reason for coming to see the elder was to seek his help in reconciling this torn apart family, right? But no such thing happens, right? Is it because like Karamazov Senior takes over the plot? Like he just or like why does that reconciliation, that a brotherhood, so to speak, why does it not happen under Zosima's charge?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think Zosima has that much to do with this as Fyodor Pavlovich does. If we look at Zosima, the like peculiar thing about him that I found is he never really actually says anything. Like he sort of reverts other people's words and just kind of shoots them back at them and lets them just ponder on it. So he's kind of like a Socrates in a way, if we can consider it in that manner. Like he'll ask a question, but it's really the person that has to make these jumps and these conclusions. And if the people themselves have no sort of desire or inclination to resolve these situations, Zosima is not going to be a miracle maker who's just going to help them figure it out, right? Dmitry did not come to that conversation thinking that he wants to resolve things, right? He basically expected Fyodor Pavlovich to attack him, right, and create a scandal. Fyodor Pavlovich came with the idea that he's going to create a scandal, right? And so what does Zosima have to do there? He's able to help if there is an inclination and a willingness of other people to help themselves. And that's why I think it works so well between him and Alyosha, because Alyosha actually makes the effort. He strives to understand himself, and through Zosima's help, move towards this understanding of his internal idea, right? But those characters that don't want to do this, such as Fyodor Pavlovich, will never achieve that. Dmitry, in that moment, also does not achieve that, right? He only achieves that through his dream, right? Which is also linked to a deeply personal memory, right? That he has. So Dmitry is another character that the character development of who is very interesting to look at, because it pretty much goes 180, right? From that conversation in the monastery to the end when he's basically saying that I'm going to go to Siberia. Or even later when he admits the possibility of running away to America.
So, just to make sure I heard you correctly, so you don't think that these characters were at least the way I'm interpreting what I'm hearing is that they were coming to the monastery in bad faith, so to speak, right? Not really just right, not really seeking any genuine reconciliation. Just so, what was the point then? Like, why come to the monastery at all?
I mean, are you requiring them to be because these are kind of literary devices, right? The characters, so we don't really necessarily need to have kind of full psychological motivation for that, right? That scene is kind of also the way in which the monastery is infected by the kind of confusion of the wider world, right? Or sorry, I jumped in there, but maybe Nikolai.
I mean, I would agree with you that
Mhm.
if we're looking at this like book as kind of, I guess, a reality, yes, they came to the monastery in bad faith.
Mhm.
That is the reason why
Mhm.
nothing really worked out. But I think the situation in the monastery, yes, as Kate pointed out, is also a literary device, right?
Mhm.
That is essentially what provokes all of the events in the novel. This is the first argument we see between Dmitry and his father. We really come to understand why Dmitry hates his father, why his father almost, wants to kill Dmitry, right? We come to know that his father is kind of interested in Grushenka, right? And he's trying to take Dmitri's love away from him. So I think this monastery scene, what it is an unraveling of these characters' selfhoods, right? It's setting the plot. And in Dostoevsky's typical way, it is done through a scandal.
Thank you.
Anybody want to ask a final question?
This isn't a question. I just wanted to echo that. I think even if we're not supposed to psychologize these characters too much and admit that this is a literary device, Dostoevsky really likes this moment where a character, I'm thinking of Приложение in Бесы, where Stavrogin comes to Tikhon, and that never gets published. It's exactly the same, right? Like, why did he even come there? He's not religious. I guess Shatov told the praises about Tikhon, and so Stavrogin has to go and like read this giant
burden himself.
Yeah, I guess so. So I guess I interpret this moment as this contradictory desire. Maybe there is something in a person that makes them want to go and do the right thing, but there's also the ego, and ultimately the ego wins, and so there's like this internal толчок to go there, but it's not realized because their ego gets in the way and the real world gets in the way. So, but I know that he really likes to do this thing, like have this moment where you have the bad and the good, and they're like together at the place of the sacred.
The thing I like about this panel is that you've kind of problematized the brothers Karamazov in a way that often it is not problematized. Like, so just to give an example, when we wrote this novel and we co-edited this volume, the Dostoevsky, the novel in modernity, for his bicentennial, we ended up having almost no sections on the brothers Karamazov because it's a kind of collection that's about rupture and mess and kind of inarticulation and things like that. But actually, the kind of these three papers today, in fact, emphasize, I think that side of the brothers Karamazov, as so did the discussion. And so there is still so much space for kind of contradictory interpretations, even of this sort of most kind of magisterial of his novels, that often is seen as a kind of, not open book, but sort of neater, let's say, and more aesthetically consistent novel. So I think I'm going to take Jer's privilege here, although I'm very happy that we went on for so long and had so much sort of more natural discussion. I think this was a great event. I'm really, all of the papers were excellent. I'm really happy to, I was really happy to hear them and to know that we're going to also, that we recorded this, that it's going to go on YouTube, that more people will be able to listen to them.